Well, where does this all take us? We find that Muslims here are now also being influenced by the same notions, and so therefore, as I alluded to initially, you're finding that many voices which are calling for a feminist interpretation of Islam. And while there doesn't exist really many of the radical feminist school of thought, those who reject religion completely and call to the worship of pagan deities and idols and witchcraft and so forth, although you find some of these voices, the majority of them, like Fatima Arnisi and others, try to argue that what they're really doing is they're bringing us back to the original Islamic teachings, and that men have misinterpreted Islam in order to further the male cause, and that they want to sort of sift through all this male interpretation and get to the true teachings that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ came with. Be that as it may, I mean, the intent of this lecture is not to really get into her arguments or others' specific arguments. What I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes or so, is sort of outline some of the basic notions that Islam has regarding men and women, and from there we can see the difference if we understand the difference in the basic concepts and notions, then anything which comes from that, we don't have to really get into its details because we can dismiss it based upon the general principles. And for this we have to start again by reviewing what the West considered originally women. As I mentioned, they did not consider women to fully share in humanity as males do. And this was based upon some of the philosophical teachings of the early Greeks. Well, in Islam we find the opposite. I mean, in Islam it's very clear from the Quran, and it's very clear from the text of the Prophet ﷺ, like especially the hadith where he said that indeed the women are the split half of men, that Islam views men and women as fully sharing in humanity. Islam does not teach, or never has Islam taught or has suggested, or Muslims have believed or held that women were less of a human being than men. And in other words, that there is the essential quality of what makes something a human being as opposed to being a chimpanzee or a lizard or something like that. Those essential qualities, that men have more of that than women. I mean, this never occurred in any Islamic school of thought. Even the most astray Islamic groups or sects never argued towards that. But all Muslims have, because it's so clear in the Quran, and it's so clear. I mean, obviously human beings recognize that by their nature, that both men and human beings are both men and women are full human beings. And because both men and women are full human beings, as a result of that, you find that the major thrust of Islamic teachings, which is the notion of submitting to Allah and worshiping Allah alone, you find that these teachings are addressed to both men and women alike, in the sense that the basic, pillars which would constitute the religion, whether the pillars of Islam, like the testimony of faith, like the prayer, like zakah, like fasting, like hajj, whether you talk about the pillars of iman, belief in Allah, the angels, the scriptures, the messengers, the last day, belief in qadr, whether the notion of ihsan, of perfecting one's worship, to worship Allah as if we were to see Him, even though we do not see Him in this world, He sees us. Men and women are addressed in this equally. And likewise, the reward which people seek from submitting Allah, and the benefits which they seek in this world and here are also given equally to men and women. I mean, it's not like if a man makes prayers, he gets more reward than if a woman made her prayers. But no, rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us in the Quran that each would get his full reward. We are from one another. And so, therefore, this is a very important notion that the West, until recently, in the last 150 years or 200 years in its literature, never thought of men and women being full in their humanity. Second to that, in terms of the state of human beings, the condition of humanity, if you look at the Quran very clearly, the Quran does not suggest that the sin that was committed by Adam and Eve was the sin of Eve alone, and that Adam was like an unwilling partner, or he was duped into that. But rather, the Quran is very clear. I mean, the dua we find in Surah Al-A'raf that Adam makes, Adam speaks in plural. O Rabbana, ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا, O our Lord, we have wronged our own souls. And if you do not forgive us and have mercy upon us, then we will be among the losers. So, here you find Adam praying with Eve, both of them saying, making this dua, and equally, repenting for their sin. Likewise, the Quran in one passage in Surah Al-Taha says that, Adam disobeyed his Lord, and so he went astray. So, it made the cause of, Adam's sin fall upon Adam's shoulder. It didn't relieve Adam of the sin as is suggested in some of the medieval teachings by Christian, theologians and philosophers. So, in that way, likewise, Muslims never thought of, women to be the cause of evil, or they have brought the evil unto men, and so therefore they're inherently something which should be, looked at with suspicion, or as inherently something which there's no good in. The third matter of great importance is regarding rights. Before I get to the matter of rights, however, though, and what Islam does recognize regarding men and women is that men and women are different. And difference here doesn't necessarily mean that one is better than the other. For instance, many of you might have memorized the passages, the first of the surah, Surah Al-Layl, in the last, the 30th part of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by night, وَاللَّيْلِ, and then he mentions it as the night covers, and then he talks about the day as it comes with its brightness, and then he says, and he who has created وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, and he who has created male and female. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions night and day, and then male and female. Could one argue that Islam teaches us that the day is inherently good and that night is inherently evil? Or, for instance, that the sun is inherently good and the moon is inherently evil, or vice versa? Or that the sky is inherently good and the earth is inherently evil? No, rather we find throughout the creation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this duality. And so therefore, just like we have night and day, sky and earth, moon and sun, we find male and female. This is one of the signs of Allah Azza wa Jal. Neither of the two can be considered evil. And likewise, however, they cannot be considered the same. And here's what the major difference is between contemporary Western thought and Islamic beliefs. The West went from the one extreme of denying women their humanity, stripping from them the notion that they are, full human beings, to the other extreme where they now try to argue that men and women are the same, that the only difference that why men act a certain way and women act a certain way is because the culture and the society teaches men to act this way and teaches women to act the other way. And that if one was to imagine that one could even teach, as I mentioned, for them to act in opposite roles. So, for instance, men would be more soft and gentle, and women would be very, strong and courageous and so forth, instead of the other. And any sort of difference that can be found in terms of physiology of male and females, they try to deny that difference has any effect upon the psychological or the mental disposition of the sexes. However, it's very clear, even scientific thought, even though it's considered to be scientific heresy, it's very clear from the scientific literature, if one looks at it, that, that it's been shown that, that the male physiology and the way leads, and the different hormones and so forth, leads to different ways of acting and different ways of reacting, and different, parts of the personality, and female physiology leads to other and so forth. That does not mean that one is good and one is bad, but rather Allah Azza wa Jal, in His wisdom, in order for humanity to exist, has created these different things in order. And as a result, since there is a distinction between the two genders or two sexes in the sense that they are not the same, they're not equal, So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has discharged or has given different obligations to each of the sexes. Obligations which will fit each sex best according to the way it was created for the purpose that Allah wanted of it. And when any sex has a certain obligation placed upon it, it then entails, as a result of that, it has greater rights.